interesting talk. Can you hear me out there now? Yes?
Okay, good. It's a pleasure to be here and to speak to a more general audience today. I would also comment, and I thank the speakers for pointing out in many cases that ethical questions permeate robotics. There's the issues of privacy we heard with the robots at home. I suspect some of you may have picked up on that. The issues in self-driving cars associated with should they obey the law? Should they be allowed to go faster in certain circumstances and conform to social norms? And a variety of different things. But this particular talk, I will be focusing on military robotic systems. And this is my primary concern. And maybe it should be yours. I'll leave that up to you to decide as well, too. I have respect at some level for human intelligence, as Oliver pointed out, but human intelligence always isn't necessarily leading to optimal solutions. I want to start by saying again that this talk is not about whether or not we should have wars. The answer to that question is obvious. We should not have wars. And unfortunately, we seem not to be able to find ways to prevent that. For those of you who are pacifists out there, I strongly encourage you to try and find ways to prevent wars from occurring in the first place. I'm trying to work with some organizations like ICT for Peace and the like as well too, to lower, using robotics, the conditions associated with the advent of war. But unfortunately, there is an assumption underlying the work that I'll be talking about that wars will continue as they have since all recorded history. So if we make that assumption, which I hope you can find a way to violate, assuming wars will continue, what is the appropriate role of robotic technology, if any? Now the militaries, and I say militaries, not just our military in the United States, but elsewhere. And by the way, I'm on leave in Australia for this year. It's been a wonderful country for those of you out there. Thank you for the opportunity to spend this time here in Brisbane for the last 10 and a half months, and I have a month and a half to go. And I'm going to miss this place, I must admit. But back to the question. I tend to digress. Forgive me. The reason the militaries are interested in robotics are for these major reasons. One, the ability to make one soldier do more than a single soldier normally could do. It's a force multiplication capability. The ability to fight wars over larger areas, expanded battle spaces, to be able to stay on station. You saw Roland talking about a 24-hour mission over Greenland. Well, the military is interested in 24-hour missions too. With human pilots, they have to eat, they have to sleep, they have to go to the bathroom, and quite often that is not conducive to long-range operations. Also to allow an individual warfighter to see further into the battle space, to be able to act further, which may mean engaging lethal force in certain circumstances as well. The primary motivation, of course, has been to reduce casualties on your side, whichever your side may be, that's deploying this particular technology. But the concern for the non-combatants in the battle space has been, at least in my mind, a secondary consideration. And we need to find ways to better protect non-combatants. Now, it's not just the US. The US is one of the leaders in this space, but many other nations are doing this. The Russians have just rolled out a new tank. The South Koreans have deployed in the DMZ. I'll mention a little bit about that later. Robots, and then rolled them back as well, too, in the DMZ between North and South Korea. The Chinese are working on systems as well, too. And Israel has for a long time been a major, not only developer, but a purveyor of military robotic systems to other countries. I believe the last count I heard was 50 or 60 countries have capabilities in this particular space. Generally not autonomous, but nonetheless what are considered robotic systems. Now, if you wanted one for yourself, you could go to the web and try and buy one. I don't think your country would let it in, but you could do it. This particular system developed in South Korea has the ability to have an autonomous, what does it say? Manual autonomous firing with safety. I don't know what that is. We talked about modular robots for your house as well too. Well, these have modular robots which contain different types of sensor packages and different weapon systems as well too. So these things are very well developed, and that's largely because the investment in military technology is quite high. And I've been a roboticist for 35 years. And as most US roboticists, not all, but most, we have done a considerable amount of work with the military. Personally, I only do unclassified research, so I'm free to talk to you about anything that I do. But there are others that do classified work, and there are others that choose, from an ethical stance, to not do any research for the military. I just read and tweeted that Google has had employees quit because of some of the work they're doing on a DARPA Maven unmanned aerial vehicle project. And there's a big petition going around at Google as well, too, for that. So people have to make decisions as to what level, if any, they are going to engage in terms of military research. But I say this to you that are roboticists out there, that if you're doing something good, something useful, someday, someone, somewhere will put it to work in a military system. So if you're doing bad research, you don't have to worry. Okay, so that's the one potential way out of that. But the debate right now is a worldwide debate. This has been going on. I've been engaged in this debate since about 2004. There's a whole bunch of reasons why I got into it. But at the United Nations in Geneva, for the last 5 years, about, I think it's 80 or 90 nations, I don't know the exact number, under the Convention for Certain Conventional Weapon Systems have been debating whether they should be banned, whether they should be regulated, what should be done with this new technology. How can we ensure that if it is going to be used, it is going to be used in a manner that is not going to create a more harm than good? And by good, I mean military good in this particular case. An entire organization, something called the Campaign for Killer Robots. How many of you heard of the Campaign for Killer Robots? There you go. Not many, but some have heard of that. That's one option. They have been calling since the initial organization, where I happen to be in attendance, the International Committee of Robot Arms Control, later snowballed into Human Rights Watch and a variety of other dozens, literally, of NGOs, calling for what's called a preemptive ban on lethal autonomous weapons. And the UN has been debating this. But there's major problems. Just like we've had trouble debating what intelligence means, we have trouble understanding what autonomy means in this particular context. To a roboticist, autonomy already exists in these particular systems. We've delegated them the authority to make a decision, and they go out and carry it out. But to others, it deals with human-level responsibility and moral agency and free will. And so we're kind of at a disconnect at times with that. And then the other side of the coin is the debate rages with respect to what's called meaningful human control. Everyone wants meaningful human control. I don't think anyone anywhere wants a Terminator, which doesn't have meaningful human control. But the question is, does that reside at every single decision to employ force, a lethal force, or does it reside at a command level structure? These are debates that have to be resolved before we start talking about bans, and what I called for initially, aligned with some of the earlier work, is with a moratorium, which is let's get it right and let's not do much until we can stop and think about it and move forward and find ways in which it can potentially actually help noncombatants, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. The United States came up with a unilateral, what I call quasi-moratorium, back in 2012, which said that there are certain classes of these systems that we are not going to develop. We are deliberately choosing not to develop them. But one of the other assumptions that I make personally is that lethal autonomy is inevitable. And the reason why I make that assumption is, by my definition at the very least, which I think is consistent with most roboticists' definition, it's here already. There are systems that exist, such as anti-tank mines, even simple anti-personnel mines, which are considered illegal due to the Ottawa Accords. But many nations, including the US and China and Russia, have not signed those particular accords. But others, cruise missiles, Aegis-class cruisers equipped with close-in weapon systems, which require extremely fast responses. And the captain turns them on, but then the system chooses to engage the target without further intervention, and many other systems as well, too. Now, do we have a system that bears moral agency or free will at this point in time? Absolutely not. And I don't think it's going to happen anytime soon. I don't know if it's 10 million to 1 or whatever, as Oliver was referring to, in terms of achieving that level of intelligence. But I'm fairly confident it's not going to occur within my lifetime, and perhaps even my children's or grandchildren's lifetime as well. But the point is that this technology is being forced upon us because of the increasing tempo of warfare. Decisions are being made faster and faster and faster, and human beings are not getting faster at making these decisions, in some cases not getting better. So the underpinnings of the work that I'll be talking about deals with the problem that I personally, and I hope you do as well too, find that the status quo with respect to non-combatant casualties is utterly and wholly unacceptable. We tolerate civilian deaths in Syria, in almost every battle space, at high levels, unacceptable levels, and we just accept it. And technology can make a difference in that particular space. If it's not lethal autonomous systems, I want to know what those systems are. We need to invest energy, money, resources into helping ways to save non-combatant lives, not just winning wars. And this is an important aspect of the kinds of things that I'll be talking about. So there are many aspects associated with this, which I'll talk about, but I like to pose this as a rhetorical question. Rhetorical questions means don't answer it. Okay? So I don't intend to answer it, although I got called in my last presentation and was forced to answer it, but I don't like to have to answer it. Should soldiers be robots? What do we do with soldiers? We train them to kill. We train them to obey orders. Things that normally are not natural for human beings. I've said in the past that that involves, at some level, dehumanization. That may be a little too strong, but nonetheless, we change their nature. We fundamentally change the nature of the human being to engage in warfare, and that makes them able to carry out the mission. And then the second question I ask is, should robots be soldiers? Could they actually be more humane than human beings? Could they be more compliant with international humanitarian law, which I'll call IHL from now on, than human beings are? And part of this goes back all the way to my roots in robotics. I've studied biological systems, intelligent biological systems, I guess I could say, all throughout my entire career, ranging from frogs and toads to the sow bug, to canines and dogs for IBO and curios, IBO for Sony's robot dog, to human beings, now looking at sloths and the slow loris. And also, ethology is involved with studying animals in their natural environment. And studying human beings in one of their natural environments, which is the battle space, is extremely depressing. And that's because we are not, in general, at our best in this particular case. Not only do we have war crimes and atrocities that get committed by a relatively small percentage, but still a significant percentage in terms of civilian casualties of our war fighters. But often there is unaimed fire and carelessness that ends up in civilian deaths as well too. These are real problems. These are things that need to be made better. And technology should focus on this aspect because it can save human life. So I ask my colleagues, and I'll ask my non-colleagues as well too, if you're of the general public, don't we have a responsibility to ensure that we can do better, that we can reduce inhumane acts within the battle space? And I've argued that ethical military robotics is one way to potentially get to that solution, but we still need to be very careful as we move forward. Now, in this position, it puts me at odds sometimes with my counterparts who are calling for a proactive ban. I am not a proponent of lethal autonomous weapons. Quite the contrary. I hope these systems never, ever would have to be used. I am not in favor of any form of killing or slaughtering human beings on the battlefield, whether they be soldiers or innocent non-combatants. But they can be, in some ways, designed to potentially reduce that damage. Consider precision-guided munitions. These are the smart bombs. These are used often in urban settings, and Human Rights Watch has actually said that if you have them, you must use them in an urban setting. Well, to me, this technology can potentially be the next generation of precision-guided munitions. very much better in terms of differentiating from combatant and non-combatant. So a research thesis I had for a very small DoD project, Department of Defense project I had many years ago, posed that ultimately we could do better with these systems than human beings can in the battlefield. And this arose from a study, and the studies that I mentioned as well too, in this particular case, but they will not be perfect. They will potentially lead to non-combatant deaths. No robot system is going to be perfect, whether it's your self-driving car, whether it's your dishwasher loader, it'll break dishes. I'm digressing again, I just have to tell a joke. How many robots does it take to change the light bulbs? 2. One to screw in the light bulb and the other to pick up the pieces. But the point is, they won't be perfect. And the pieces here will be civilian casualties, and that's unacceptable. But if we can do better, and this gets to the ethical question from a consequentialist point of view, a utilitarian point of view, we may be able to save lives. And to me, that's important. So initially, these were the underlying criteria we tried to build into these systems. One is the right of refusal for an unethical order, the ability to monitor and report the behavior of others, other human beings that may be creating infractions in the battle space. This, of course, makes the military uncomfortable. It might make you uncomfortable, too, if you saw the movie 2001 and said, sorry, Dave, I can't do that, as one of the possible answers of a robot. But to try and incorporate some of the existing laws of war, the rules of engagement into these systems. Recognizing, again, we don't have to do it all. We will not have full-bore human moral reasoning in these systems anytime soon, for the same reason we won't have moral agency, as I mentioned. That's too hard. Intelligence and moral intelligence is extremely hard to be able to do. But that's not to say that we can't embed the rules that human beings have created and the laws that human beings have created, and find ways for these systems to comply with them in narrow, bounded circumstances. That's the argument that I make. Now, when I first started this work, this was a picture from The Economist that gave a nice review of the underlying principles, but that kind of showed what I was trying to do, is how can we ensure that these systems will comply ethically? This was a tongue-in-cheek photograph, obviously, but that was the underlying principle. And there are good reasons for optimism. We are making progress. Yes, we're winning. You forgot Jeopardy, Oliver. That was a good one to add to your list of things that we've been able to do with Watson. A little more explicit, I guess. And things have been moving faster and faster with AI. We have to be careful and manage expectations as responsible scientists so that you don't think that we're going to have all the solutions within the next 2, 5, 10 years to these kinds of problems. And I think that's been done by my colleagues so far to date. But we also need to recognize that progress is being made. And the big problem is that technology is being created faster than we have the ability to regulate it or legislate it. And this is a problem, because at one level, I'm quoting Oliver again, we don't know what we're doing. I mean, maybe we don't understand it, but we actually don't know what we're doing. We're creating this stuff, we're throwing it out into the world, and we're not fully aware of the social implications of this technology. We need to do better on that as well, too. But getting back to lethal systems, these are the kinds of criteria I argue for, where we should have bounded morality. They shouldn't be used where there's high presence of civilians. That precludes counterinsurgency. Operations, high-intensity interstate warfare, which is something we'd never like to think about, but we keep hearing from time to time, at least in our nation, from the East and the West and the West and the East, whatever. The military is always concerned with the war after next, not just the next war. But also maintaining a human presence in the battlefield is crucially important so that we can remember how horrible war actually is. This is important, that the vision, I don't see the military's interested in, at this point in time, of entire robots, war fighters against robot fighters. That's not likely to occur because they're just not smart enough, among other things, but it's just, there's something called the warfighter ethos, and why people sign up to fight. They want to be a part of it. They want to give have the potential to give their lives for their country or cause. Now, these are the reasons I believe that ethical autonomy can work. A whole bunch. They can assume far more risk on behalf of the non-combatant than any human soldier in their right mind would. Ultimately, we will have better sensors for these systems that can see through walls, which they can now, see better and cut through the fog of war. We can cut out the emotions of these systems. I have patents in robots' emotions with Samsung and Sony, but we can avoid certain emotions which cloud judgment, like anger, fear, frustration, and make people do things that they really shouldn't do and probably really don't want to do, but they still do it anyway, and a variety of other aspects, including monitoring the behavior of others. But as you might imagine, in my years of talking about this particular approach, I've been challenged in a whole bunch of different ways. And there are many reasons why we have to think very carefully about that. The whole notion of responsibility is crucially important. Cybersecurity, how can these systems be hacked? The effect on just risk-free warfare, is it truly risk-free? I have answers for, I believe, all these questions. I don't have time to go into those, but I'd be happy to if we have any question and answer period time left as well, too. And mission creep is one which worries me probably more than most, which means basically you design a system for a particular purpose, and then the user decides to use it for something in which it was unintended to be able to, unintended for its use. And I have examples of that as well too. So what do we include in these systems? We include the notions of just war theory, something referred to as jus in bello, and that is enshrined in the Geneva Conventions, international humanitarian law, that you have to have a reason to engage a target, so-called military necessity. You cannot incur unnecessary suffering when you're engaging a target. You have to use the right force level that is appropriate for the particular target that you've chosen. That's proportionality. And you have to be able to distinguish non-combatants from combatants before engaging a particular target. Now, I can tell you and give you a talk on you're not actually a war criminal if you kill civilians. You're a war criminal if you kill civilians intentionally. This dates back to the Middle Ages and St. Augustine and the principle of double effect, where there's a military good and an associated evil, and if one outweighs the other, if it's the good achieved is better than the collateral damage that occurs, it's evil, but it's acceptable evil in that case, and you're not a criminal. But if you don't adhere to these particular principles, you might find yourself in a different situation. To address this, we designed an ethical architecture. For those of you who are technically minded, there's plenty of publications on our website. I even have a book on the subject as well, too. Others have began to explore this space in a variety of different domains. In our case, we dealt with the mathematical underpinnings, translated that into architectural design, and then implemented it in simulation. We do not have lethal autonomous robots in our laboratory, but we tested these in some cases on example scenarios, including, I don't know, how much time do I have left?
We have a story tonight that has to do with a single photograph. It's a surveillance photo taken in Afghanistan and obtained exclusively by NBC News. It's a photo of a gathering of Taliban fighters, but some say it shows more than that. Some say it shows what was a perfect opportunity to take out the enemy, but the military was unable to take the shot. The question is why? It was NBC News correspondent Kerry Sanders who obtained this photo exclusively. He reports for us tonight from Kabul.
Brian, it took 5 days for the U.S. military to consider my request to declassify the photograph. It's a grainy still image that shows what some here in Afghanistan say was a lost opportunity to inflict serious damage on the Taliban.
Army intelligence officers say the photo shows 190 members of the Taliban at a funeral 2 months ago. The U.S. Army claims among those in the formation, high-ranking members of the Taliban leadership. An unmanned armed predator like this one was spying on the group. Intelligence officers monitoring the scene in real time wanted to fire. They asked permission. The request went to intelligence analysts, senior commanders, and lawyers. But intelligence officers were told no, they were not allowed to fire. Why? U.S. rules of engagement do not permit waging war in a cemetery.
That was frustrating. Those individuals live to fight another day, potentially could cause harm to our soldiers, civilians, the population of government Afghanistan.
Despite frustration, U.S. military leaders here say the decision not to fire was the right one.
Meantime, the Taliban fight by their own.
Keep in mind again that these systems can make the decision not to fire, not only when to fire. That would have been an easy implementation with no kill zones and geographic limitations. Whether that was the actual rule of engagement is another story. This shows a system that was deployed in the DMZ and tested and then removed by Samsung Techwin. It had the ability to track targets. I believe it was 5 kilometers a day and 2 kilometers at night. Engage had a machine gun. The machine gun couldn't shoot that far, obviously. It was on a post. They were investigating also mobile versions of this. But this is an area still, today, which is an active war zone. There's an armistice, but if you cross this MDL, you can be shot, the military demarcation line. Hopefully that will change in the near future, again, so these systems will never, ever have to be used. This was, I just have to show this because I was at the Brisbane Science Fair, the World Science Fair you guys hold a couple of years ago. They put this video together of a version of our implementation of this work to show how we can use these systems to constrain through what's called deontic logic, the logic of permissions, obligations, and permissions, using that as a constraining mechanism for making sure that these systems do not do things that they should not do, perhaps better than human warfighters would. Don't have time to show it all, but there's many video results on our website if you're interested in finding out. But to achieve this, it's not an immediate turnaround. I'm not going to make any promises or pretenses that this is something we can solve tomorrow. It's probably a full 10-year agenda if it was adequately funded. There are many, many open research questions that have to be resolved, even how to test these systems effectively before deployment. But my bigger concern is that these systems may be rushed into the battle space under the pressure of warfare without adequate testing and development. Other countries have been considering ethical algorithms, Israel as well too, at least according to a classified leaked report, according to Wired, in terms of guiding their pilots in certain things. Helping people to make better decisions is where technology can come to play, especially when those decisions have to be made very rapidly. So my bottom line for this is I'm not averse to a ban. I've always said that, but I believe we're better served by a moratorium. And I do believe that if these systems can be developed to outperform human warfighters with respect to IHL compliance, we have a moral imperative to deploy those. And I believe regulation, strong regulation, at least initially, is required to make sure that these systems are not used in ways which increase the danger already faced by non-combatants in the battle space. But perhaps most importantly is let's not make our decisions based on unfounded fears foisted upon us by Hollywood and elsewhere that make us fearful, existential threats, all this other stuff as well too. Let's think carefully about what it is, what are the benefits, what are the risks, and make up your own mind. And then speak to your government. Let them know what you think. I'm not going to tell you what to think. I'm just going to point out several options that you can potentially envision. But become a part of the decision making. And one other strategy that's available, which is an interesting one, which says basically, if there's any technology that violates the dictates of the public conscience, it can be banned in and of itself. This has been in international humanitarian law since its very beginning. But just like we can't define autonomy, we really can't define what violates the dictates of the public conscience as well, unfortunately. But this may be the first case where it might be exercised if you really have an aversion to the thought of a machine taking human life. So bottom line, or top line actually, is the more important one here. I still find it unacceptable that we tolerate non-combatant deaths at the level that we do. We have to do better. Whether we need existing IHL or not is a subject to debate, but we as scientists and engineers need to pay attention to this particular problem. And with that, I'll thank you. Happy to.
Questions?
Hi, I come from a lab which says no to working with military or military applications, but still I have a question that is perhaps relevant in terms of the responsibility point that you mentioned in your slides. The question is the current society in the same level to accept the term accident the way we accept it for humans? So when machines make a mistake, which can happen, the responsibility is solely laid on the machine most of the times. With humans, we are a bit more acceptable to the word accident. So how does the ethical side of things stand here?
Well, let me relate that to the self-driving car debate. Think how many people are killed in automobile accidents. That's a machine. Every year. Incredible numbers. And we have tolerated that for amazing amounts of times. One of the primary arguments for the deployment of self-driving cars is the same as I'm arguing here, is that it could potentially result in a saving of human lives. We get drunk drivers off the road, we get people that have road rage, no more texting, if we get it right. That's the important thing. We have to get it right before that happens, or it could make it worse. So the same arguments apply there. You're right about responsibility. The only paper I ever wrote with a punctuation mark other than a colon in it is the robot didn't do it, period. There is no way you can blame the robot, or any machine for that matter, for the results of a mistake or a criminal act. The whole point is it's the same as if a precision-guided munition landed on a school or a church or a mosque. If it ended up killing those individuals, can you say the bomb did it? No, it's somewhere in the human chain. It could be the commander who knew this was a defective munition and continued to use it. It could be the person who loaded it on the aircraft and bent the fin, perhaps deliberately. It could be the person who lays the target and deliberately lays the school. But it becomes hard to separate intentionality in the human mind because you don't really know what that individual is thinking. You become a war criminal when it's intentional. You are not a war criminal when it's an accident in general. So I would argue that these systems could lead to better accountability in terms of traces of what happened for these things in the event and when these accidents do occur, or intentional acts as well too. So I hope that answers your question.
There is one question in the back.
So I know that it operates under a different set of laws, but how do you think what you said might be applied to local policing, particularly in scenarios like the United States where there are a lot of civilian deaths from police?
Yeah, that's an interesting point, which you brought out, RoboCop scenarios and the like. I have generally argued that the application of lethal force in domestic settings should be banned. Even the military uses something called the rules of the use of force as opposed to the rules of engagement, which I guess you were referring to in that case. It's a different type of problem. Quite often you can use a siege mentality as opposed to having to maintain operational tempo and moving through a particular space. There are things, for example, that you might not be aware of, but I've learned a lot from the Geneva Conventions over the past few years. For example, tear gas is perfectly legal in domestic settings. It is a criminal act in warfare to use gases of any particular type. You might wonder why, but it has to flushing people out and shooting them as they come out of caves and the like. But I am not for domestic use of lethal force. Whether we can use, and because of the notion of what's called force escalation, which is often used in domestic settings. You can fire a warning shot, you can aim to wound, you can do all these things before applying lethal force, where in the battlefield you are taught to kill, take the target out and neutralize them, unless you happen to be a sniper, but that's another story. You can take advantage of the different timescales, the different escalations that occur from a human perspective, and whether it should be used for non-lethal weapons as well too. And there's a big debate raging as well too. What is the role of non-lethal weaponry in the military and in warfare, which is not as simple as it sounds. Having heard warfighters who have been dead set against it due to the fact of the indecision as to whether to use lethal force or non-lethal force when engaging a target, which may end up costing them their lives. So it's a different scenario, and at least until I am convinced otherwise, I agree with you that there are so many mistakes that are occurring right now, especially in the United States with the application of lethal force in policing situations. We could try and do something that would improve that. I would argue for safeties. Imagine we had safeties, for example, and this is really almost science fiction, but imagine you could put safeties on weapons, if we're still going to have those, which would require you to confirm based on some target analysis that that happened to be a child or that happened to be an unarmed person by an independent second AI authority, so to speak. That could put your life in danger as well, too. So until I feel comfortable about it, I don't believe that lethal force in police settings is appropriate.
Thank you very much.